For today's video, I'm going to be comparing the Walstad method with the Father Fish method to try and help people better understand the key differences between them. I understand where a lot of the confusion comes from, especially if you're new to the hobby, because both methods are built around using capped dirt with plants. But there are some subtle differences between how the two methods work that can make it problematic if you try and blend the two in the same tank. Around half of my aquariums use methods like these, but I will be showing clips from all of my tanks as this is a long video and it just changes up the footage to keep things interesting. So I want to start by talking about the substrate composition in each of the methods because this is one of the biggest differences between them. In the Walstad method, you simply use a base layer of topsoil that is then capped with either sand or gravel. That's it, there is nothing else added to the substrate, and Diana Walstad even specifies in her book that you should be using a basic garden or potting soil without fertilizers, additives or enhancements. In contrast, the Father Fish method uses soil that's mixed with a variety of additives before being capped with sand. Father Fish does list out each of the additives as well as the specific amount he uses at the 4.5 minute mark in this video on the screen now, so you can easily make your own if you like, but he does sell pre-made batches on his website. Father Fish claims that these additives will help extend the soil's nutrient supply well beyond 1 year if you use it in your setup. He claims that this addresses a problem that he sees with the Walstad method, where he believes they tend to fail after around 1 year of use when the soil starts running out of nutrients. However, there's a very important difference between the two methods when it comes to how you add additional nutrients into the tank over an extended period of time. I'll go into feeding in more detail later in this video, but Diana Walstad dedicates an entire chapter in her book to the topic of plant nutrients, with fish food playing a major role. She also specifies that she always feeds her fish generously and intentionally adds a little extra food to benefit the plants too. Even though she does confirm that the soil used in her system may only provide carbon for around 11 months, she also explains how fish food and bacterial decomposition can help keep the nutrient cycle going indefinitely. Father Fish, on the other hand, is known for using a living food web inside of the tank, and he uses far less food compared to the Walstad method. In this one of his videos, at around the 10.5 minute mark, he starts to explain that after around 5 years, his tanks are essentially fully recycled, with organic matter naturally breaking down into detritus to support the plants over a long period of time. However, I personally believe that this recycling process happens far quicker in a Walstad method tank simply because you are adding a lot more food to the system. More fish food means more fish waste and leftover food decaying, which fuels more plant growth, and as older plant leaves start to decay, they produce more detritus to keep the cycle in the Walstad method tank going. Because of this, I do think that the soil enhancements that Father Fish uses are probably more important with his specific setup because of the lower amount of fish food you add to the tank. But I really don't think that these extra additives are necessary in a Walstad method tank where you are adding a lot more fish food and then the detritus cycle kicks in a lot quicker. One thing that I would strongly caution against is trying to mix these two approaches in your own aquarium. For example, if you're using the Father Fish soil enhancements but following the Walstad feeding strategy, you are adding a lot of nutrients into your tank. In my opinion, this combination could easily lead to an excessive buildup of nutrients in the aquarium and cause major problems down the line. Next, I want to talk about substrate depth and the specific materials used for the capping layer in these aquariums, because this is another major area where the two methods differ. In the Walstad method, the general recommendation is to use around 1 inch of soil that is then capped with no more than 1 inch of small gravel. Diana also specifies that the gravel should be between 2 and 3 millimeters in size, and personally that's what I've seen great results with in my own Walstad method tanks. She also notes that you can use sand if needed, but if you do, the sand cap should only be around 3/4 of an inch deep. This is because the sand creates a far tighter seal than gravel and it can end up suffocating the soil of oxygen if your sand cap is too thick. So in my opinion, she is specifically recommending that you avoid low oxygen conditions in the substrate due to the potential risk of hydrogen sulfide buildup in tanks that are fed a lot of fish food. In this Father Fish video at around the 8-minute mark, Father Fish recommends using a 1-inch layer of dirt that is then capped with 2 inches of sand. The issue here is that he doesn't specify a specific sand grain size, and that does matter a lot because there's a lot of different sand particle sizes available and they can provide very different results. If you look at this grain size chart, for example, you'll see there's multiple categories from very fine to very coarse sand, each with their own unique grain size. As I mentioned earlier, Diana Walstad specifically recommends a grain size of between 2 and 3 millimeters, which is right on the boundary between very coarse sand and very fine gravel. In my experience, using a 2mm gravel with a capping depth that is 1 inch or less allows enough water with dissolved oxygen into the soil to prevent low oxygen zones from forming in a Walstad Method tank. However, I'm not sure the same would be true with the 2-inch deep sand cap that Father Fish suggests, especially if the sand grain size is on the smaller side. This is because the smaller particle size pack very tightly together, limiting the amount of oxygen movement in the substrate, creating low oxygen zones. In this Father Fish video, at around the 4-minute mark, he says that the 2-inch sand cap is needed to counter Brownian motion, which he believes causes soil particles to rise into the sand layer. He also claims that Brownian motion is limited by the depth of the specific material. For example, a 1-inch layer of soil can only move up a maximum of 1 inch into the sand, so a 2-inch layer of sand cap prevents this from escaping into the water column. But, to my understanding at least, this is not correct. As far as I can tell, Brownian motion specifically refers to the random movement of particles suspended in fluid, and there's no strict limit on how far they can move. Also, the soil layer in his tanks aren't suspended in fluid as they are trapped under a sand cap. So, personally, I believe that trapped gas is escaping the soil and that's why it's pushing some of the dirt into the capping layer in that specific method. If you're familiar with my channel, you may notice that when I set my Walstad Method tanks up, I like to add enough water so there's about 1 inch or 2 above the substrate and then leave it to let the gas escape from the substrate before filling the rest of the tank. In my experience, this makes it a lot easier to fix any issues with the capping layer due to this initial gas releasing from the substrate. However, a potential problem with the Father Fish method is that the combination of a deep cap of fine-grained sand might limit oxygen penetration into the substrate. This could cause hypoxic, anoxic and anaerobic zones to form in the substrate, which are areas with little to no oxygen, and these can form gas pockets that will then eventually escape through the substrate, pushing soil into the sand cap. In my experience with the Walstad method, this isn't really a major problem once the initial trapped gases have escaped from the tank setup. While small gas pockets can still form in a Walstad method substrate, the lighter and shallower gravel cap makes it far easier for the gas to escape without disturbing the substrate layers. That said, the low oxygen zones in a Father Fish method tank can actually offer a benefit, and I do think this could be a main factor in how that specific tank setup works. In 2015, researchers discovered 2 new varieties of Nitrospira bacteria that are complete ammonia oxidizers. This means that a single organism is able to convert toxic ammonia into toxic nitrite and then into the far less toxic nitrate. These specialist bacteria thrive in low oxygen environments and could play a role in maintaining safe and stable water parameters in a Father Fish style setup. Additionally, back in 1990, scientists identified 3 different types of anaerobic ammonium oxidizing bacteria. These also require a very low oxygen environment to thrive, and these have the ability to convert ammonium and nitrite at the same time directly into nitrogen gas, further helping to maintain safe and stable water parameters. Now, to be clear, it is very controversial whether true low oxygen environments like these can be formed in a home aquarium, but there is actually some research showing that it can happen. On top of that, I've also observed similar behaviours in some of my tanks that use lava rock for hardscape, where they can have low oxygen zones inside of the rock due to its porous nature. So, whether or not Brownian motion is the true cause of the soil and sand mixing in a fatherfish tank, the presence of low oxygen zones in the substrate could still foster beneficial bacteria colonies that will help support the nitrogen cycle in the tank. So moving on, and we get to plants, and this is another area where the 2 methods potentially differ a lot. Diana Walstad's general advice is to start with healthy plants and experiment with a wide range of different species, especially if you're new to the hobby, to see what thrives in your specific tank water. There's dedicated chapters in the book going over how to use plants as natural water purifiers and how they obtain nutrients directly from the water column, and why floating plants are so important to the Walstad method. As you read through them, it does become clear that fast-grown plants are key to natural water purification and very important with the Walstad method. Diana Walstad does mention a few specific fast-grown stem plants like Hygrophila polysperma and Rotala rotundifolia, both of which I use myself and highly recommend. So a core takeaway here is that specifically with the Walstad method, fast-grown plants are used to help naturally purify the water and remove various types of toxins. On the other hand, the fatherfish method doesn't seem to have any specific recommendations when it comes to plant selection. Then in this video, at the 6-minute 45-second mark, he lists plants he uses during one of his tank setups to show how you'd set his method up in a fresh aquarium, and he does mention some specific plants. In that particular video, he uses moss, Bucephalandra, Aponogeton, Bulbitis, Rotala indica, and what he calls Bucephalandra scarlet temple. From what I can tell, scarlet temple is just a common name for Alternanthera renekii that's used in the United States, but this doesn't change my point. Out of that specific list of plants, the only one that I'd consider a strong natural water purifier is the Rotala indica. In this video, at the 16-minute 45-second mark, Fatherfish does specifically recommend using stem plants, but it does seem to be tied more to a promotion that he's running on his website for discounted stem plants rather than an emphasis on their benefits as water purifiers. Also, based on the Fatherfish videos that I've seen, and I will be honest, I really haven't seen many of them, he doesn't seem to mention floating plants, and they are a crucial part of the Walstad method setup. Now, to be fair, there could actually be a legitimate reason for the difference in specific plant recommendations between the 2 different methods. If the fatherfish method relies more on minimal feeding and specialist bacteria living in a low oxygen environment in the substrate to control ammonia and nitrite, fast-grown plants may not be required to keep the water safe for your fish. However, in my opinion, this could leave the fatherfish system vulnerable to issues with TDS or total dissolved solid buildup over time that will require water changes to manage. Now, there is a very common myth that TDS or total dissolved solids will only ever increase in an aquarium where water changes aren't done on a regular basis, but that is not true. There's a lot of research from both the wastewater treatment industry and the phytoremediation industry that both show that the right plants can absorb a surprising amount of ions that make up a TDS count. Fortunately, the fast-grown plants recommended in the Walstad method like duckweed, water lettuce, Rotala rotundifolia and Hygrophila polysperma are all excellent for managing TDS and have plenty of research to back this up. So not only does the Walstad Method's plant selection help reduce toxic nitrogen compounds like ammonia and nitrite in your water, but it will also absorb and lock away TDS ions, helping to keep your tank safe and stable. The way that I personally like to look at TDS is that a lot of people do manage it by doing water changes in their tank, but a slowly increasing number of people remove the TDS elements when they remove the excess plant growth from their aquarium. The challenge here is that a lot of people are specifically drawn to the father fish method because of its appeal of low water changes. While specialist bacteria in the substrate and minimal feeding can manage ammonia and nitrite, they don't really do much to counter rising TDS levels beyond reducing the nitrogen compounds that contribute to it. So if you are only topping off evaporated water without performing partial water changes in a father fish style tank without fast growing stem plants, minerals can definitely start to build up, and it might happen surprisingly quickly depending on your temperature. While it may take a while to start impacting the majority of fish, sensitive fish species and things like shrimp can start to suffer much sooner, especially if there's an increase in metals like copper. So returning to the plants I mentioned earlier directly from one of the father fish method videos, which were moss, bucephalandra, aponogeton, bulbitis, rotala indica, and alternanthera renekii, in my opinion it's very unlikely that just the rotala indica, especially planted in the amounts he did, would be able to manage TDS. Now you might be thinking you can just add more fast-grown plants to a father fish method tank and you'll be able to counter the TDS buildup and reduce the requirement of water changes. But there is actually a risk to this because fast-grown plants use up a lot of the nitrogen compounds that those specialist bacteria in the substrate require, so that could crash those bacteria colonies, and then because you're feeding a lot less, those fast-grown stem plants can also crash and basically destroy the system. So while there is a lot more research available that backs up the Walstad method and the plant choices used for that specific system, I still check the water parameters of all of my tanks once per month, and until very recently it was once per week, and I would do water changes as required, but with the plant selection for the Walstad method it is very rare. Next, I want to talk about cycling your aquarium because this is a very important step that helps plants and microorganisms process toxic nitrogen compounds and keep your fish safe. There's several ways to cycle a tank, especially a dirted one, but this stage is where many people make mistakes, making things far harder than they need to be. In her article about small planted tanks for pet shrimp, Diana Walstad specifically mentions that she does sometimes add shrimp immediately after the setup, but she usually recommends against it and recommends you wait for the cycle to complete. Then she explains that newly set up dirted tanks can experience spikes in various toxins, so frequent water changes may often be needed with a brand new setup. Father Fish seems to recommend the fish-in cycling method, and while on paper this can make sense, there are some potential problems that are often overlooked even by Father Fish himself. So due to this, I don't personally recommend using a fish-in cycle with this type of tank, be it the Father Fish method or the Walstad method, but Diana Walstad at least makes you aware of the additional risks. Now, one thing that is 100% not true with the Father Fish method is that in this video, at the 50-second mark, he claims that tanks can't cycle without fish, but that is 100% incorrect. The Dark Start method, for example, proves that tanks can be cycled without fish by using an ammonia source to simulate a bioload in the tank, and I've successfully used this method countless times in my own tanks now. On top of that, a lot of my friends have started to use this method without issue, and then on top of that again, Green Aqua, who are one of the most respected aquascaping brands on the planet, have dedicated articles going over how you can do this. Additionally, throughout his nearly 10-minute video on cycling a dirted tank with fish, Father Fish doesn't mention water-soluble or water-insoluble ammonia even once, focusing on fish food as a source of ammonia. This overlooks a major problem in dirted tanks that someone with decades of experience should be aware of and should be mentioning in such a specific video. But to better understand cycling, it is important to know what's actually happening with the nitrogen compounds in your aquarium. Fish waste, uneaten food, and other decaying organic matter such as plant leaves release toxic ammonia into your water as they decompose. If your soil contains a lot of water-soluble nitrogen, it can also release a significant amount of ammonia. While a lot of people still believe that nitrite is the second nitrogen compound to appear in a newly set up aquarium, ammonium actually shows up a lot earlier. Ammonium forms when an excess hydrogen ion in your aquarium water bonds with ammonia, making it far less toxic to your fish. Then, nitrifying bacteria and archaea in your aquarium will convert the toxic ammonia into toxic nitrite, and then a different type of bacteria converts the nitrite into the far safer nitrate. As I touched on earlier, there are some specialist bacteria that aren't present in all aquariums that can also work on ammonium and make sure that all of the nitrogen compounds in the tank are controlled. Now, I know some of those words sound very similar and they mean very different things, so I want to do a quick summary just for clarification. Ammonia and nitrite are toxic and can cause various problems in your fish, plants, shrimp and snails if they are left unchecked and unmanaged. Ammonium and nitrate are far less toxic and often seen as plant food in this type of aquarium because they are both preferred essential sources of nitrogen for aquatic plants. So during the initial cycle of a Walstad or Father Fish Method tank, plants, beneficial archaea and various types of bacteria all work together to bring toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite levels down to almost zero, creating a safe environment for your aquarium. However, this process can take 4 to 6 weeks in my experience when setting up a brand new aquarium and not having access to anything to reduce the cycling time in your tank. That's why I personally recommend against even trying a fishing cycle with this type of tank, even if you are experienced. But, as I mentioned earlier, the specific type of ammonia in your soil does matter a lot. If you live in the United States, you can check the guaranteed analysis box on your soil to get a good idea of the amount of water-soluble and water-insoluble nitrogen in the pack. Unfortunately, in most other countries this information isn't on the packaging, so it's definitely more of a guessing game and just asking your friends in the hobby what they've experienced with soils they've tried. If your soil has a high amount of water-soluble ammonia, then you may not need to add any ammonia sources to cycle your tank, as the ammonia released from your soil can easily be enough. For example, here in the United Kingdom, I personally use the Westland topsoil, which spikes my ammonia up to 0.5 ppm, allowing plants, archaea and bacteria to establish themselves after around a month and keep everything safe and stable. I recently helped someone on Facebook with a Father Fish style tank that was having problems, and the soil they used caused ammonia to spike up to 4 ppm because it just released so much water soluble ammonia into the water column. In rare cases, if your soil has no water-soluble ammonia, your plants may be able to manage everything from the start, so technically at least you could slowly introduce a few fish at the beginning and feed lightly like Father Fish recommends. But there's just so many unknowns with this type of tank during the initial setup that I just don't recommend it, and I honestly think everyone is better off just letting it cycle and then adding livestock. I know that a lot of people choose these specific methods because they are seen as budget friendly, but I still strongly recommend people get a test kit to monitor your tank's water parameters during the cycle. If a liquid test kit is out of your budget, then some ammonia dip test strips can be better than nothing. It's also worth noting that high ammonia levels isn't just toxic to fish, shrimp and certain species of snail, it can also melt certain sensitive plant species, especially plants that are grown in vitro cups. So if you are cycling a dirted tank, always monitor your toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite levels, and if they rise above 5 ppm, start doing regular partial water changes to protect your plants. Diana Walstad even mentions in her video collaboration with KG Tropicals on YouTube that she was doing 90% water changes on a regular basis when she set up one of her planted shrimp bowls. Then, once your toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite levels are consistently reading 0 ppm on a test kit, you can start thinking about adding fish or shrimp or snails to the tank. So moving on, I want to actually go over how I personally think each of these methods holds the nitrogen cycle once the tank is actually established, because I do suspect things work differently in each method. Now before I go any further, I want to say that a lot of people are drawn to these methods because they want to run a filterless tank, but it's important to note that both Diana Walstad and Father Fish have confirmed that they use filters in at least some of their aquariums. Depending on the tank setup, the filter may act as a secondary support for biological filtration rather than being the primary driver, and in some cases no filters may be required at all, but I just wanted to point that out. So Diana Walstad is very clear about using fast-grown plants as the main natural filtration system in her method. With the Father Fish method, the role of the plants is less clear due to a lack of specific plant species being recommended. While he does mention bacteria in the substrate as playing a role in some of his videos, the plants he typically recommends are far slower grown species than what's usually recommended for the bulk of the Walstad method tank. As I mentioned earlier, the Walstad method is strongly supported by a lot of independent research from the wastewater treatment and phytoremediation industry, which proves that fast-grown plants are very effective at naturally purifying water in multiple ways. To be fair to the Father Fish method, there are still studies showing that low oxygen bacteria strains, which I personally suspect are very important in his tanks, can be effective, but most of those research papers are based on industrial setups with controlled oxygen levels, not aquariums. There is one study that specifically observes these bacteria in an aquarium as well as their effects, and it does suggest that they can work if the environment is perfect. Now before I go any further, I want to say that both of these methods are supported by the standard nitrifying bacteria and archaea that most aquariums will rely on for biological filtration. In aquatic environments, most plants seem to prefer ammonium rather than nitrate as their primary nitrogen source when it's available, and this is important with both methods. The faster a plant grows, the more ammonium it needs to support that healthy growth. So as plants consume ammonium, they'll help shift the ammonia to ammonium ratio, reducing the amount of free ammonia in the tank by forcing the excess hydrogen ions to convert more ammonia into less toxic ammonium to keep the ratio correct for your specific pH. This helps to make your tank far safer for your fish because less ammonia means fewer nitrites are produced, meaning a smaller colony of nitrite oxygen bacteria are required to complete the cycle. Once ammonium levels drop to 0, aquatic plants typically switch to using nitrate as their preferred nitrogen source, helping to prevent a nitrate buildup in the tank too. While plants can, in theory at least, switch from using nitrate to nitrite as a nutrient source in the absence of ammonium and nitrate, this does seem to be very rare in this type of tank, and I don't think it happens much. This is because in my experience with all of my Walstad tanks, and considering I check the water parameters on a regular basis, I don't remember ever seeing one of them have a nitrate level of 0 ppm, so there's always some nitrate for the plants to use. So just a quick summary for the Walstad method, because fast-grown plants use up ammonium in the tank to convert more toxic ammonia to the less toxic ammonium. This passive ammonia control also limits the nitrite production in the tank, requiring smaller bacteria colonies to convert the toxic nitrite into the less toxic nitrate. And then the live plants mop up the excess nitrate in the tank to maintain balance and keep everything safe and stable. Now we'll switch over to the Father Fish method. As I've kind of hinted at through the video, because of the lack of specific recommendations to use fast-grown stem plants and the insistence on using essentially a 3-inch deep layer of substrate with a very, very fine capping layer, I do think that plants are less important with the father fish method when it comes to maintaining the cycle. To my current understanding of the father fish method, I suspect that the complete ammonia oxidizing bacteria and the anaerobic ammonium oxidizing bacteria that I mentioned earlier in the video are doing a lot of the heavy lifting in a father fish style tank. So ammonia appears in the tank via fish food, fish waste and decomposing organic matter. Hydrogen ions then bind with the toxic ammonia to form the less toxic ammonium. The slower grown plants in a father fish style tank will still use up some of the ammonium, but not enough to manage all of it. So standard nitrifying bacteria colonies start to grow to support the needs of the tank and convert the ammonia into nitrite. Here's where things start to shift because the anaerobic ammonium oxidizing bacteria require both ammonium and nitrite to be present at the same time to function. So when the conditions are right, these bacteria kick in, helping to manage ammonium levels and directly reducing nitrite, but instead of producing nitrate, they produce nitrogen gas which will harmlessly gas out of the aquarium. In theory, denitrifying bacteria can also develop under these conditions, helping to convert any remaining nitrate in the tank into nitrogen gas, making it gas out of the tank too. This dramatically reduces the nitrate buildup, forcing the slower grown plants to continue to use ammonium as their primary nitrogen source, and the lower the ammonium amount in the tank, the safer everything becomes with this specific system. I know that's a lot of information to take in, and there's some specialist bacteria strains in there that aren't commonly discussed in the hobby, but I do think this type of thing is key to how the father fish method can hold the cycle. I will link to my blog post on beneficial bacteria in the description where I cover these bacteria strains in more detail, as well as include over 50 independent sources to back everything up. So after that, let's move on to fertilization, because once again there are some pretty significant differences between the two methods here. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Diana Walstad is very open about using fish food as a nutrient source in her method. There's an entire chapter in the book dedicated to the different nutrient sources in the system, as well as a sub-chapter in a different section of the book specifically on how bacterial decomposition helps release essential minerals into the system. I know I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to repeat the quote from Diana Walstad herself where she says, "I always feed my fish well, plus add a little extra for the plants." In my opinion, this simple line highlights a core difference between the Walstad method and the father fish method. I like to think of the Walstad method as having two different stages of fertilization, one of them being short term and one of them being long term. The short term comes from the soil which you add during the initial setup, and it provides essential macro and micronutrients to help plants establish themselves and grow. Humic substances in the soil are also broken down by bacteria and release small amounts of natural CO2 in the water to further assist the initial plant growth and get the filtration system kicked in. While certain nutrients in the soil like iron can last a very, very long time, others, especially carbon, may deplete in as little as 12 months. That is where the long-term secondary fertilization kicks in with the Walstad method, and this is the detritus buildup. As fish waste, leftover food and decaying plant matter accumulate in the tank, they continue to provide nutrients to maintain the system. Then you're essentially letting natural decomposition and bacterial processing recycle the nutrients from the leftover food, fish waste and decaying plant matter in the ecosystem. Diana Walstad also mentions that liquid fertilizers can be used if needed, particularly for potassium, which is one of the most common deficiencies in planted tanks, but in my experience it's not essential and may only be needed with certain plant species. Now the father fish method takes a very different approach, and instead of feeding heavily like the Walstad method, he feeds very lightly and relies on his soil mix to supplement the nutrients in the substrate. The mix is designed to keep the substrate nutrient rich for up to 5 years when using his method, which he says is how long it takes for his substrate to fully recycle. However, from my experience, Walstad tanks just don't need that kind of supplementation because of how much you're feeding the tank. I have 2 Walstad Method tanks that are over a year old now, and judging by how frequently I'm still trimming their excess plant growth, they are still thriving, and I honestly believe it's because of that long-term secondary fertilization system kicking in. Father Fish also has a video discussing liquid fertilizers, and I honestly don't think he understands how they actually work or even what they are, if I'm brutally honest. At the 2-minute mark of the video, one of the guests on his live stream holds up a bottle of API Leaf Zone and says it only contains iron and potassium and asks if it's okay to use. Father Fish instantly replies saying it's just adding excess iron and excess potassium, and claims that it will increase your water hardness until your tank becomes like the Dead Sea. Now there's a few problems with that alone, and the first one is that iron and potassium don't raise your water hardness. General and carbonate hardness are primarily affected by calcium and magnesium, not iron and potassium. The second issue is that plants absorb nutrient salts from the water column, and there's extensive documentation showing that aquarium plants can effectively use these nutrients to prevent a buildup. And the third issue is that it's commonly known that potassium is a deficient nutrient in aquariums, and to some extent so is bioavailable iron, but it does seem to only affect certain plant species. As I mentioned earlier, Diana Walstad herself recommends using liquid fertilizers that contain iron and potassium, pretty much like API Leaf Zone. And just to quickly clear something else up that he says in that video, the Dead Sea can't support life because of its extremely high salinity, not because of its water hardness. To put it in perspective, the Dead Sea is around 9 times saltier than ocean water, and it's a geological phenomenon that doesn't apply to controlled aquarium environments. Now, to be fair, as far as I'm aware at least, Father Fish does not use any type of liquid fertilization in his aquarium, so he may just not have any experience with these. On top of that, I also think there may be some confusion with him when it comes to the difference between sodium chloride, as in table salt that we use on our food, and actual mineral salts that are used for fertilization. They are very, very different things, and 2 Hour Aquarist has an excellent blog post going over them, and the UCAPS forum has a lot of threads on how you can literally take dry mineral salts and make your own liquid fertilizers for your plants at a fraction of the cost of the commercial ones. After that, the guest also suggests that water changes can be used to manage the supposed hardness levels increasing, and Father Fish responds with water changes won't remove everything. Now this is correct, but what he fails to mention is that the plants in the tank will happily absorb potassium and nutrients over time, especially if you stop adding more of that liquid fertilizer, so the excess nutrients aren't going to stick around forever. In another video, Father Fish recommends using dead fish as a fertilizer in your aquarium, and at around the 34-second mark, he explains that Native Americans use dead fish to fertilize corn by burying them next to the roots of the plant. Now this does make sense for terrestrial plants that are grown on land, but it doesn't really translate that well to aquatic environments. Terrestrial land plants rely almost entirely on the root uptake of nutrients because there's none present in the air. But marsh and aquatic plants in their submerged forms are a totally different story, and this is confirmed by multiple sources, but the most authoritative one I can find is the Aqua Design Armano blog post. As you can see, they literally confirm that aquatic plants can absorb nutrients through their leaves and stems, and that is why liquid fertilization is so heavily recommended. Personally, I do leave any naturally deceased shrimp in my tank, especially in my shrimp colonies where there's hundreds and hundreds of shrimp. As long as I'm confident that that shrimp died because of natural causes rather than disease, I just let them break down in the tank and they are gone within a day or two and then recycled into the ecosystem. Now, the biggest fish I personally keep is a Siamese algae eater, and I wouldn't leave anything larger than a neon tetra or maybe a harlequin rasbora in the tank for something like this just because of the risk of an ammonia spike. But the key point is there is no need to bury the fish in the substrate. Not only will your fish, shrimp and snails break down the smaller deceased animals, but waste-eating bacteria will also help drastically speeding up the time it takes to get the job done. And that brings me on to another concern, and I may be misremembering something, but I'm pretty sure I have seen a video where Father Fish actually buries a dead fish in the substrate in the video and advises other people to do the same. Unfortunately, I can't find that exact clip, but due to the nature of it, YouTube may have forced him to delete it, but he does mention this practice in the description of this video if you have a 2-inch sand cap over your soil. Now, there's two different problems with this. The first is that you risk disturbing the soil layer, which can cloud the tank water and release mud into the tank, potentially resulting in the need for a complete rescape. The second potential problem is that you may expose the low oxygen zones in the substrate to oxygen-rich water, disrupting the delicate balance needed for the specialist bacteria to thrive. As I've said earlier, I personally believe that these anaerobic and low oxygen bacteria strains are very important to how the Father Fish method works. So, needlessly disrupting those zones even briefly could compromise your tank and potentially crash your cycle. I just want to emphasize again that mixing the fertilization strategies from both of these methods is not a good idea in my opinion. If you're using an enhanced substrate like the Father Fish method and then trying to feed your tank a high amount of food like the Walstad method, you are putting a lot of nutrients into that aquarium. Each method is designed to work as a self-contained ecosystem, and mixing them can create problems, so I just don't recommend it. Choose one and stick with it. Next up, I want to talk about feeding, and once again there are some pretty big differences between the two methods here too. As I mentioned earlier, high quality fish food given in moderate to large amounts is key for the Walstad method. Not only does the food feed your fish, shrimp and snails, but it also provides essential nutrients for your plants through waste and decomposition. One potential issue is using low quality foods that are deficient in a lot of key nutrients, which can cause an imbalance in the Walstad system. For example, Heron Ultra Tropical Flakes, a popular budget food here in the United Kingdom, lists brewer's yeast as their main ingredient, which is definitely not ideal. Personally, I try to avoid any fish food that doesn't list some sort of insect or fish meal as the primary ingredient, and I'm also looking for high quality secondary and tertiary ingredients if possible. It is worth pointing out that I only keep omnivorous fish, so if you do only keep herbivores, then look for foods that have high quality plant-based food ingredients in them. Here's a few foods that I highly recommend, and I've used them in all of my Walstad and non-Walstad tanks for years without issue. The first is fluval bug bites, which has black soldier fly larvae as its primary ingredient, followed by salmon meal. The second is Hikari micro pellets and Hikari shrimp cuisine, as both have fish meal as their primary ingredient, followed by krill meal. And third, we have Hikari Sinkin wafers and Hikari mini algae wafers, where fish meal is the primary ingredient, but with these two, the extra high quality ingredients are further down in the mix. It's also worth paying attention to wording, as some brands like Aquarium list fish derivatives as their primary ingredient. The term fish derivatives is a very broad category and can include the low quality parts of the fish with less nutrients in it, unlike the term fish meal, which is more nutrient dense. Honestly, in my experience, for nano fish keepers, alternating between fluval bug bites and Hikari micro pellets daily just to switch up the main ingredients in your fish's diet is more than enough, and my fish love it. Now the father fish method handles feeding differently, and instead of relying on heavily feeding the tank, it emphasises light feeding and encourages the development of a natural food web in the tank. These natural food webs are based on fish hunting small organisms like scuds and ostracods in the aquarium to feed themselves. Now I have actually tried something similar in my 29-gallon Zebra Danio tank, and the fish absolutely loved going after the scuds and ostracods in there, so I can definitely see the appeal of this kind of setup. But there are two potential downsides of this method. The first one is that living organisms provide minimal benefits to your plants. While they will produce waste that can act as fertilization, much of what they consume is converted into energy for their life, meaning they don't contribute nearly as much nutrients to the ecosystem as decomposing fish food and waste. Now this isn't a problem in a strict father fish setup, but if you're trying to blend father fish with Walstad, then you can have issues here. The second issue that I personally have with this is the resurrection jar method that father fish recommends to introduce the microfauna into the tank, as it carries significant risk in my opinion. A resurrection jar typically involves collecting mud and mulch from a local waterway and keeping it in a jar for a couple of weeks and then adding it to your aquarium. While you are encouraged to visually inspect it for potential hazards, an eyeball check is nowhere near enough in my opinion. Now I do get asked my opinion in the comments section on resurrection jars fairly regularly, so just for the record, I am 100% against using them. So let's have a look at why I'm so against the use of resurrection jars in the hobby, because a lot of the aquarium fish that we keep in the hobby have evolved in ecosystems thousands of miles away from where we live, and they probably don't have any immunity to local parasites and pathogens. You can just look at human history for countless examples of this, but the most well-known one, at least here in the West, is when Europeans arrived in the Americas. Diseases like smallpox, measles and influenza wiped out 90% of the native population because they hadn't evolved to have any natural immunity to it. On top of that, many of the fish that we keep in the hobby are captive bred and often have reduced genetic diversity due to inbreeding. One research paper found that captive bred guppies only had a 58% survival rate when exposed to a natural parasite from their habitat where they've evolved for millions of years, compared to wild guppies that had a 96% survival rate. As I mentioned earlier, I do understand the appeal of building a natural food web, and as I said earlier, I have tried it in my Zebra Danio tank and it was really fun to watch. But instead of using a resurrection jar, I bought commercially bred aquatic insects from reputable pond suppliers here in the UK where the risks were controlled. Father Fish does mention controlling parasites with other parasites at the 19-minute mark of this video, which is partially true. The concept he's referring to is called competitive exclusion, and we all take advantage of this in dirted tanks. Essentially, we are relying on this principle when fast-grown non-pathogenic bacteria start to dominate a system due to their faster doubling times, limiting the numbers of pathogenic, dangerous bacteria in the aquarium. If you are using a dirted tank, thankfully it's very likely that you have the right types of bacillus bacteria in the dirt that you purchase, but you can purchase products like Fritzyme 360 or any other waste gunk-eating bacteria intended for cleaning your filter, and it will contain these bacteria strains in them. However, I am less convinced that this method works reliably well when it comes to parasites or fungi that are introduced to a tank through resurrection jars. Father Fish also claims in that video that 99% of all parasites attack other parasites, but he doesn't provide a source for that statistic, and I would be interested to see one. So in short, I do see the appeal of building a food web in your aquarium, and I do think it's fun, and I definitely want to try it again in the future, but personally I am not using a resurrection jar. I'm just going to go to a pond supplier and buy everything there. Next up, let's talk about water temperature, and once again there's some key differences between the two methods. Diana Walstad recommends keeping your water temperature above 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius when using her method. The main reason for this is that plant growth efficiency drastically starts to drop off below that water temperature. I did experiment with a few cold water Walstad Method aquariums last winter, and based on my experiences with those, I definitely agree with her, and moving forward I will be using a heater in all of my Walstad tanks. On the other hand, in this video around the 9-minute 20-second mark, Father Fish recommends a water temperature of 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius. Now, he did get a little dramatic in that clip for some reason, acting as if maintaining a tank at that temperature is controversial, but in all honesty that's a very standard temperature for people who keep betta fish and a lot of other tropical species. It's also relatively close to the middle of the temperature range recommended by Fritz Aquatics for their beneficial bacteria in a bottle products. So to me, these recommended water temperature differences also reinforce the bigger picture that I mentioned earlier, where the Walstad method leans heavier towards plant growth for filtration, but the Father Fish method seems to lean more towards bacteria and archaea doing the heavy lifting. So moving on to lighting, and again you've probably guessed it, this is another area where the two methods differ a lot. Diana Walstad famously says that almost any light will do for her method, and in my experience this is pretty solid advice. But this will depend on the lighting requirements of the specific plants that you are wanting to keep in your tank, but with modern LED technology I really do think it's a true statement. One of my good friends uses a regular bedside table lamp for his Walstad Method aquarium, and he's successfully grown Rotala rotundifolia, Salvinia, a couple of different types of crypts, and dwarf Sagittaria without issue. Personally, I use budget-friendly lights like the Ciora SR616 on the majority of my Walstad Method aquariums, which are full spectrum and come with built-in timers, making them simple and easy to use. But the best part is, here in the UK at least, the nano tank sizes of those lights actually cost less than my friend's bedside lamp that he uses for his tank. One thing that I have recently noticed, even though I've read Diana Walstad's book multiple times, is that she actually recommends a 12-hour photo period, and I currently use a 6-hour photo period, so I might tweak that in the future. From what I can tell, it's due to the logic that shorter photo periods usually mean winter's starting to come around and plants may adjust their behaviour accordingly. But overall, the Walstad method doesn't require expensive or high-powered lighting, and in most cases a cheap, suitable LED light will get the job done, provided you stick with easy category plants, which she recommends. Now, switching over to Father Fish, and this is where I strongly disagree with his lighting advice, so I do want to acknowledge he's been in the hobby for decades, and a lot of his advice does come from old school fish keeping. In this video, at the 5-minute 15-second mark, he recommends using a minimum of 100 watts of lighting power per 20 US gallons of water. Now this might have made a little more sense in the days of T5, T8 and T12 fluorescent tubes, which are far less efficient than modern LED technology, but even then I don't think it's even close to the realistic wattage requirements. But please don't go out and get yourself a 100-watt light for a Father Fish style tank. There is absolutely no need with modern LED tech. Not only will you be paying for an expensive 100-watt LED that you don't actually need, but your ongoing electricity bill just to power it are going to be extremely high. On top of that, other than Alternanthera reneckii, I don't actually remember him recommending any plant that even requires moderate lighting intensity, never mind high lighting intensity. So in my opinion, you should just be going with a modern LED lighting fixture like the Ciora SR616, which I link in the description as an affiliate link, but you can choose any modern LED light that you can find in your area. I'm very confident they will get the job done. Next up is water changes, and this is easily one of the most controversial topics with the Walstad and Father Fish methods. Diana Walstad states that frequent water changes aren't necessary with her method, and she may only do a water change every 3 to 6 months in her established tanks. But she does note that newer setups often require frequent water changes in the first few months due to ammonia being released from the soil. If you're familiar with my channel, then you'll probably know that this is an approach that I personally follow myself with my Walstad Method tanks. As I've mentioned a couple of times, there is plenty of research shown that fast-growing aquatic plants can effectively manage nitrogen compounds and total dissolved solids, the two main reasons most people do water changes. Personally, I have no issues doing water changes if there's a valid reason to do them, but in my Walstad Method tanks, there's rarely a reason. For example, my 40-gallon non-Walstad Method tank gets a 50% water change every month with a filter deep clean, but this is not due to nitrogen or TDS issues, it's to keep phosphate levels low and prevent hair algae outbreaks, which this tank has always had issues with. My non-Walstad Method betta fish tank gets a 25% weekly water change right now too, because I'm running a sort of DIY version of estimated index in fertilization, which does quickly increase the TDS, so I have to change the water. I also want to be very clear here, I own multiple test kits and test equipment that check for different things, and I'm currently checking every single one of my tanks at least once a month, and until recently I was doing it every single week. But my point here is that if you stock and feed your tank appropriately, for the Walstad Method, you probably won't need to do water changes as frequently as with other tank setups. Now let's switch over to the Father Fish method, and in my opinion, he doesn't recommend or use enough fast-grown types of plants that are going to be able to effectively manage TDS levels in the tank. But to be fair to the Father Fish method, he does feed considerably less than the Walstad method, and then even though there are minerals in tap water that enter the tank during water top-offs to counter evaporation, his plant selection may be able to keep pace with that. Then there's that very controversial stop changing your water video from Father Fish with the clickbait thumbnail and intro for the video. Now, personally, I actually find that video really hard to follow along with and understand what he's trying to say, but that might be an issue with me because even since I was a child, I've always been better at learning if I can just read something rather than have someone tell me something. From what I can gather, the core message of the video seems to be kind of similar to the Walstad method, where if your water parameters are stable and within acceptable ranges for the species you keep, regular water changes aren't necessary. However, around the 7-minute 15-second mark, Father Fish does introduce a more questionable theory, and that is that fish become accustomed to their specific water conditions and moving them to a new water source may cause them to die. Now, this myth does seem to be increasing in popularity, and in all honesty, it could have sourced from Father Fish and people just haven't questioned it because he said it and then they've been repeating it ever since. But first, let me share a personal example that I feel disproves this theory. Last year, one of my Walstad Method tanks had an unexpected ammonia spike due to overfeeding. On my part, it was a complete oversight, so I had to perform a large emergency partial water change. The tank hadn't had any water changes in months, it had only had water top-offs to counter evaporation, but despite this huge sudden shift in water parameters, both the cherry shrimp colony and the Medaka rice fish in that tank are still thriving almost 8 months later. Then we can also look at the plop and drop method, a common and well accepted way to add new fish to your aquarium, but ideally to a quarantine tank. You simply temperature match the bag that the fish came in, then you'll net the fish, place them straight into your tank without any slow drip acclimatization. A lot of people who've ordered their fish online and potentially even local aquatic stores likely have very different water parameters from the shop they bought them from, yet this is still one of the most widely used methods in the hobby. Jason from Primetime Aquatics has a great video explaining the actual science behind why the plop and drop method is often the safest option and it's worth checking it out. He actually holds a master's degree in biotechnology and chemical science as well as his qualification in aquaculture and fish health, so he's well equipped to speak on that topic, more than most people, myself included. But even with all of those qualifications, he still recommends the very commonly used plop and drop method over drip acclimatization, even with the rapid changes in water parameters. Then we can also consider the massive volume of fish moved between breeders, wholesalers and shops all over the world, often with extremely different water parameters to each other. Then on top of that, we also have people rehoming fish they have had for very long periods of time because they need to take the tank down and sell them to people in other areas who have different water parameters to them with no ill effects. So here's my main takeaway for water changes regardless of the method, because both Diana Walstad and Father Fish agree that routine partial water changes aren't necessary if your tank's water parameters are safe and stable. That said, if something does go wrong, like the unexpected ammonia spike I had in my tank, do the water change to keep your fish safe. Don't worry about some mythical compound that apparently forms in your tank over time that fish become accustomed to, but no one can actually name the compound of for you to research. I honestly think it's just people getting confused on how TDS works, especially in Walstad style tanks where the plants manage a lot of it for you. So yeah, if your tank actually needs a water change, definitely do it. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been able to help people better understand the differences between the two methods and why in many cases it can be difficult or even a bad idea to try and mix the two together. Thanks for watching the video, have a good day and good luck with your dirted tanks.